Imagine waking up not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the crackling of frost forming inside your wooden hut. The smell of boiled cabbage still lingers from last night's meal. If you were lucky enough to have one, outside your mud-caked boots are frozen stiff, and your day is already considered late by village standards. There are no weekends, no holidays, no free time. Just another endless day in the life of a medieval peasant. But what if we told you that some peasants could read? That one of them almost became a king? That forgotten stories written by candlelight still whisper from the margins of unfinished books? Welcome to a side of the Middle Ages you may have never seen. Step into their shoes if they had any. In this series, we bring history to life through immersive storytelling. From the Black Death to the Spanish Inquisition, the Middle Ages were a wild ride, and we're just getting started. You are a peasant in 14th century Europe. Let us spin the wheel of misfortune. Ah, bad luck. You have landed on Do Not Collect 200. Welcome to the Dark Ages. What do you mean? No, this isn't Game of Thrones. I am your host. This is Life Noggin, and today we're going medieval. Seriously, today we're going medieval. Here are the top 5 things that sucked about being a peasant in medieval times. Part 1, your feet hurt. If you were a peasant in 14th century Europe, you likely did not truly own anything. Not your land, not your tools, not even your time. You belonged not legally, but practically to the lord whose estate you served, and your life followed a rhythm as ancient as the soil itself. Wake before the sun, tend the fire, feed the animals, work the fields, eat if there is food, sleep if there is warmth. Repeat, that was your world. There was no comfort, no predictability, and absolutely no such thing as privacy. Part 2, you smelled like cabbage. Your home, if it could be called that, was a one-room hut crudely built with timber frames and plastered with wattle and mud. The floor was covered with straw, often crawling with bugs. Your bed might be a pile of reeds shared with your children, your spouse, and sometimes even a goat. If it rained, the roof leaked. If it snowed, the walls would weep moisture. If there was drought, hunger would come knocking, and hunger came often. Your diet was monotonous, made up mostly of whatever the seasons allowed. Coarse bread from rye or barley, some beans or lentils, maybe a turnip, and if you were fortunate, a bit of cheese. Meat was a rare luxury. Vegetables were boiled into a thin stew called pottage. And cabbage, a winter staple, clung to your breath, skin, and clothes. It was so ubiquitous that travelers could smell a peasant village long before they ever saw it. Part 3, you had no free time. There were no weekends, though holy days offered brief breaks from work. But these were not days of leisure. They were days of worship, and sometimes required walking several miles to a nearby church barefoot or in worn sandals, regardless of weather. Part 4, your clothes were itchy. Peasants wore simple tunics and trousers made of linen or wool, and often had to make their own clothing. This was hard and time-consuming, especially since peasants were expected to wear the colors assigned to their social class. Peasants were generally restricted to drab colors like brown, gray, green, while the wealthy wore brighter colors to display their status. However, peasants weren't completely without adornment. Women might wear colorful headscarves, and men might fashion their hats with feathers or jewels they found while working the fields. Children, too, dressed like their parents, except in miniature. Clothing was meant to be practical, allowing them to move about easily and protecting them from the elements. In fact, a good tunic could last a lifetime if mended as needed. Part 5, you couldn't escape your destiny. Perhaps the worst part of being a peasant was the utter lack of hope for advancement. Your father was a farmer, your grandfather was a farmer, and unless the heavens intervened, so too would your children be. Even the most talented peasant could not hope to become a knight or a merchant, let alone the king. And those who tried to climb the social ladder were often punished harshly. For example, peasants who tried to make their own wine to sell were often beaten and imprisoned by the wealthy landowner who had a monopoly on the sale of wine in the area. Still, a few managed to find ways to improve their lives. Some children chose not to follow in their parents' footsteps. Some dared to reach for something else, like the boy who once pretended to be a king. It's me. This has been Life Noggin. Don't forget to keep on thinking. A story that ends before it begins is a cruel trick of fate. This one is also a mystery that continues to elude historians. It concerns Margaret Beaufort and her son Henry Tudor, two figures whose fates would soon intertwine with the future of England. 1469 was a year of chaos in England. The Wars of the Roses were in full bloom, and Margaret Beaufort found herself in a precarious situation. She was the widow of Edmund, the Earl of Richmond, a title that once carried great weight but had been diminished during the tumultuous rule of Edward IV. Yet Margaret was far from a typical noble widow. She was ambitious, tenacious, and most importantly, she believed her son Henry had a claim to the throne of England. Her efforts to secure her son's future would lead to an astonishing revelation. On September 26, 1469, she wrote to a trusted ally, Lord Stanley, seeking his assistance in safeguarding her son's safety. It's a desperate plea that gives us a glimpse into her anxieties and determination. She expresses her fear that the young Prince Henry has become a target and reveals her resolve to ensure his survival at any cost. 2 months later, her fears were realized. Margaret found herself confined to a cell in the Tower of London, imprisoned by none other than her cousin, the infamous Elizabeth Woodville, wife of Edward IV. The details surrounding this dramatic turn of events are shrouded in secrecy. Margaret's confinement lasted only 3 weeks, suggesting a swift and surprising resolution. As swiftly as she'd been imprisoned, Margaret was released and her son's life was spared. Once again, the specifics are lost to history. However, the immediate aftermath of these events had profound implications for England's future. Less than 2 decades later, Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII, would claim victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending the Plantagenet dynasty and beginning the Tudor era. The mysterious events of 1469, featuring Margaret Beaufort and her son, played a pivotal role in shaping this outcome. The question is, how? Why did Margaret Beaufort take such drastic measures to protect her son? How did her actions influence the trajectory of England's history? What role did the enigmatic Richard III play in this drama? And why did Elizabeth Woodville choose to imprison Margaret? Unfortunately, due to the scarcity of records from that era, we are left to piece together the answers to these questions. Historians have done their best to reconstruct the events of 1469, but the missing pieces continue to pose a tantalizing puzzle. All we know comes from a handful of letters, legal documents, and chronicles written many years later. These sources offer glimpses into the lives of these key players and their motivations, but they do not provide a complete picture. We see Margaret Beaufort as a determined mother fiercely protective of her son's well-being and future. We see Elizabeth Woodville as a cunning and ruthless player in the game of power, willing to use any means necessary to secure her family's position. We see Richard III as a conflicted figure caught between his duty to his family and his desire for peace and stability in a war-torn country. We see them as historical figures grappling with the same universal emotions and desires as you and I: love, fear, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of security. In the end, though, we are left with more questions than answers. What exactly was the nature of Margaret Beaufort's relationship with Henry Tudor? How did she manage to navigate the treacherous waters of 15th century politics and secure her son's future? What role did Richard III play in these events, and how did he balance his conflicting loyalties? And ultimately, what led to the downfall of Elizabeth Woodville and the collapse of the Plantagenet dynasty? As we stand in the shadow of these giants of history, their humanity shines through the sparse records reminding us that they were not just names on a page, but real people with hopes, fears, and dreams for their families and their country. In a time when the rules were written for kings, it was a mother's love that proved to be the most powerful force of all. Margaret Beaufort's story reminds us that sometimes the most important chapters in history are the ones left unwritten. This lack of records allows us to marvel at the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. It allows us to appreciate the strength and determination of a mother who would stop at nothing to protect her child. But it also leaves us with a sense of wonder about what might have been. What if the records from 1469 had survived? What if we knew the full extent of Margaret Beaufort's ambitions and her son's claim to the throne? What if we understood the machinations that led to Richard III's decision to imprison his own brother? These questions may never be answered, but they serve as a reminder that history is not just about the past. It is about the mysteries that continue to captivate us and the stories that continue to shape our world. In the midst of an age of faith, science and reason were taking root. The Renaissance was around the corner, and maybe this scribe had one foot in the future, leaving us with one of history's great cliffhangers. This is a production by Invicta. When people think of medieval manuscripts, they often imagine great cathedrals of books, like the Library of Congress or the British Library. And yes, some medieval manuscripts are there, but many more remain where they were made. This one is no exception. The unfinished manuscript was created sometime between 1278 and 1300 in southern France, likely at the Benedictine monastery of Sainte Mary de la Grace. Its script is elegant, its illuminations exquisite, and its subject matter fascinating. It describes the lives of several saints, including the legendary Saint Ursula, whose story goes back to the 4th century. According to the tales written about her, she was a virgin martyr who defied the advances of an invading king. He killed her companions, but when he came for her, she vanished. Some say she turned into a stag. Others, that the ground beneath her feet split open and swallowed her whole. These stories, violent and fantastical, are interspersed with those of other holy men and women, each chosen for their purity, piety, or miraculous powers. Together, they form a kind of saint's scrapbook, a collection of exemplary lives designed to inspire medieval Christians. But the text itself is only part of the story. The scribe who created this codex was clearly proud of his work. He took great pains to ensure it would be beautiful, filling the margins with more than 100 drawings, each one a miniature masterpiece. There are two-headed birds, fantastic beasts, grotesque figures that seem to peer out at us from the page. Intertwined among them are delicate flowers, architectural motifs, and even musical instruments. One drawing shows a monk playing a stringed instrument while dancing. Another shows him tumbling head over heels. Medieval monks weren't supposed to dance, let alone dance provocatively. So these marginalia, so full of life, may reflect a kind of subversive playfulness, a way for the scribe to blow off some steam while still upholding the sanctity of the text itself. There are also symbols that appear again and again, particularly along the edges of the text block, the central section containing the writing. These include the Agnus Dei, a lamb carrying a flag said to represent Christ; the Chi Rho, a combination of the first two letters of the Greek word for Christ, and a simple cross. These symbols were not merely decorative. They were part of a medieval tradition known as rubrication, in which the edges of manuscripts were colored to protect them from evil spirits. In this case, the protective border was drawn in red and blue, two colors associated with the Virgin Mary. Red symbolized her courage in defending her son, while blue represented her heavenly wisdom. Together, they formed a kind of barrier between the text and any potential harm. When we look at these drawings, we're seeing the work of someone highly skilled. The scribe was not just a writer, but an artist too, and a very good one. His talent might have been recognized. He may have even received patronage for his work. But for all our admiration, We must remember that to medieval Christians, these illuminations were more than just pretty pictures. They were sacred objects imbued with spiritual power. For them, images were not merely representations of the world, but participants in it. The scribe, therefore, was not just a copyist, but a collaborator in the divine. So who was he? We don't know his name. He isn't mentioned in any surviving documents. All we have are these drawings, this unfinished book, and the tantalizing mystery of why it was never finished. Did the scribe die? Was he taken from his work by forces beyond his control? Or did he simply walk away? Sadly, there are no answers, only questions. But this unsolved mystery is what makes this manuscript so compelling. It's a reminder that history isn't just about finding answers. It's also about embracing the unknown. This has been a production. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe. And thank you for watching. I do love a good mystery, and this 12th century manuscript is one of my favorite unsolved puzzles. What happened here? Why did the scribe suddenly stop writing? And how did this particular book survive when all the others from this abbey were destroyed? This is what I love about old books. They have so many stories to tell, not just in the text, but in their very creation, production, reception, use, and even neglect. Each book is a journey through time with something new to discover every time you look. This manuscript was created around the year 1180. It is a collection of biblical texts paired with commentary by a very learned man named Thomas, who was a monk here at the Abbey of St. Remy in southern France. Now the problem is that this isn't the end of the story. These are the last 2 pages of the manuscript. And as you can see, the scribe has gotten distracted. He hasn't put down his quill. He just stopped writing in the middle of a sentence. Now we know from other manuscripts that he was working on a strict schedule. So why would he have stopped in the middle of a word? Well, as I said, there are many stories in an old book like this, and one of them's written in the margins. In the centuries after this book was made, people would occasionally come across it and puzzle over its sudden ending. So they would add their own comments, thoughts, even doodles. And this little flourish here, this bird that looks like it's flying away, was added around the year 1480, so about 300 years after our scribe put down his quill. In the 15th century, books were still precious objects. They were expensive and rare. So when someone came across this oddity, they took it upon themselves to finish the job, so to speak. And they dated their addition to the text with the year 1480. But this isn't the only note in the margins. Look here. Can you read that? It says, "He who finds the beginning of this book, let him write here the day on which he finds the ending." Whoever wrote this must have been pretty confident that the book was going to turn up again. And he was right, because here in the top corner of this page, someone later wrote the date 1619. So the story of the book doesn't end there either. There are even more stories to tell, because here in this margin, we have these little faces peering over the edge of the page. And here there are little birds taking flight. It almost feels as though the book itself invites us to imagine what might happen next, like a game of exquisite corpse. There are thousands of medieval texts like this, thousands of books with commentary on Scripture. But this one is my favorite. It's the only one I know that has this kind of strange silence, this sudden stop in the middle of a thought. Most of these manuscripts were copied because they were important, either because they contained useful knowledge or because they were Scripture. But this one feels different. It feels personal, introspective, as though we've stumbled in on a private moment. It feels less like a church sermon and more like a diary that ended mid-thought. It reminds us that not all history is conquest and ceremony. Some of it is a parchment left blank by a hand that was once steady, now forgotten. And in those empty pages, we are invited to wonder, not about battles or kings, but about a single moment of pause in the middle of an ordinary life. Meanwhile, Just a few miles away, in another part of France, another life would have looked very different. Not silence, but sound. Not stillness, but strict routine. The elite lived not in uncertainty, but in carefully curated rhythms. And their days were as demanding in their own way as any peasants. If you've ever played a strategy game, or RPG, with a medieval setting, then you're probably familiar with the so-called nobility, the class of people who owned most of the land and everyone else's lives. But what did these nobles actually do all day? The answer may surprise you. It's me, and this is my channel. Welcome to part 4 of our series on medieval life. We've previously discussed how common folk lived, died, and farmed. Now we're going to look at the higher life. If you imagine the medieval nobility, lounging on velvet cushions, drinking wine by roaring fires, you are only partly right. Life for the elite was indeed rich in color, ceremony, and comfort, but it was far from idle. A noble as daily routine in the 13th or 14th century was a world apart from that of the peasantry, yet it followed a pattern just as rigid, just as consuming. Your day began early. Even as a lord or lady, you rose with the sun or soon after. Servants would help you dress, for your clothing was not simple. Layer upon layer, from fine linen undershirts to embroidered tunics, girdles, and outer cloaks. Every thread was a message. To wear silk was to speak of trade connections. To wear fur meant wealth. To wear the wrong thing, a political misstep. Breakfast was light, perhaps bread, ale, and cheese, and then the day began. For the lord of the castle, this meant meetings with stewards and bailiffs. Estates needed constant managing. How much grain had been harvested? Were the livestock healthy? Was the village mill operating? Even in times of peace, overseeing the land was a full-time occupation. If it was a day of court, the castle would become a hub of noise and business. Tenants arrived to settle disputes, request permissions, or pay their dues. The lord listened, judged, commanded. Sometimes scribes recorded everything. Other times decisions were passed by word alone. Justice was a big part of a nobleman's duties, but so was dispensing patronage, that is, giving out favors and gifts. This could mean money, land, or a noble title. Kings awarded the nobility for service, for winning a battle, for bearing an important office. Lords and ladies in turn rewarded those who served them, whether handsomely or not. Much of medieval life was about building and maintaining networks of obligation. The lady of the castle had no fewer responsibilities. She might oversee the kitchens, ensure supplies were stocked, or direct the activities of dozens of servants. She was also expected to set a moral and spiritual example, helping manage the chapel, arrange charity for the poor, and instruct younger women in noble conduct. And in the rare quiet moments, she embroidered her stitches, often telling stories from scripture or romance. A noblewoman's life was generally safer and more comfortable than that of a man, but she had less freedom. Marriage was a major event, not just for her, but for the entire region. A king's daughter might be wed to a neighboring lord to cement an alliance. Heirs apparent, that is, the nobles intended to carry on their bloodline, were married with great fanfare. Marriages were carefully arranged, but love was not unknown. Rulers like Edward III of England kept mistresses, as did many another noble. Yet these liaisons rarely resulted in legitimate children. For the most part, even in the bedroom, a noble's duty came first. Life for nobles ended when their usefulness did. As a man aged, his sons took over more and more responsibilities, managing the estate, taking on more land, bearing more titles. The old lord became a figurehead. Women, once they were widowed, had more freedom, but were expected to be especially thrifty. They ran households with a fine-toothed comb, making sure every penny was accounted for. Some women chose to enter religious life, running convents or becoming influential abbesses. In the end, though, the medieval nobility were not so different from today's wealthy. They worked hard, played hard, managed large organizations, doled out favors, and tried to stay one step ahead of the competition. Their work was more vital, their rewards greater, but their problems were also larger. If the king was at war, a noble was expected to raise troops, supply provisions, perhaps even go into battle. A noble's life was more dangerous, more public, more pressured. It was a world away from the struggles of the peasant, but it was far from the leisurely existence we sometimes imagine. Thanks for watching. For more about life in the Middle Ages, check out our series playlist or our other videos about medieval history. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. In the heart of Europe, in the 14th century, the sun beat down on the ramparts of a mighty castle. Within its high walls, two very different lives were lived. For our peasant, the morning began at dawn. A fire to be lit, crops to be gathered in, animals to be fed. The day was long, and the work was hard. For the nobleman, the morning began over a leisurely breakfast. Eggs, perhaps, or fruit from the extensive gardens, maybe some cheese from the stores, or bread fresh from the oven. The children would join them, their tutors close behind. Then came midday and the main meal. And this, for the nobility, was a performance. Long wooden tables in the great hall, silver dishes, trenches of bread instead of plates. A rotating menu of game meats, fresh baked pies, stewed vegetables and sauces, rich with imported spices. There was music, there were jesters, and there was strict etiquette. Who sat where? Who could speak and when? It all mattered. For the peasants, midday brought a simple meal of porridge or soup, perhaps some bread if they were lucky, eaten quickly in the fields or on the road. There was no time for ceremony. Work was never far from the mind. Afterward came recreation. The noble children might study Latin with a tutor. The men might go hawking or practice swordplay in the courtyard. The women might walk the gardens or play music. Every act was part of an education in nobility, measured, mannered, meaningful. Evenings brought prayer, then more meetings, more correspondence. Sometimes entertainment, a traveling bard, a troupe of acrobats, or a masked ball if the season allowed. All the while, for the peasant, the work continued. Repairs to be made, crops to be stored, fires to be kept. The evening meal was simple, eaten in silence, sometimes in darkness. The only entertainment the flickering flames and the stories they brought from the day. The lord and lady, meanwhile, might take their places at the head of the table, a reminder of their position, their power, their privilege. Theirs was a life of luxury, of leisure, of lineage. They traced their ancestry back through generations of nobility, each name a link in an unbroken chain. Their word was law within the castle walls. Their influence extended to the lands beyond, their wealth seemingly endless. For the peasant, wealth was measured in what could be carried, in what could be bartered, in what could be sold. As the night deepened, the lord and lady might retire to private chambers, warmed by tapestries and thick stone walls, and guarded by loyalty and layers of stone. Yet castle life was not without its tensions. Politics seeped into everything. Marriages were strategic, friendships, even the smallest smile, a calculation. An alliance could rise with a toast, or collapse with a missed bow. For the peasant, life was harder still. Storms and floods and blight, the constant fear of an empty larder, the ever-present threat of disease. Superstition colored every hour, every action, every word. Curses were cast and prayers were pleaded. Healing herbs and charms were sought. Life was a daily battle. One fought not just for survival, but for hope. Theirs were two very different lives, the peasant and the noble, yet both were bound by the same medieval clock, a clock that chimed out duty and measured moments in the lives of both. A clock that told out the hours, Big Ben style, from mighty towers that dominated the skyline. These great bell towers were a feature of the medieval landscape. Their bells rang out 5 times a day, summoning the city to prayer, marking the hours for all to hear. And yet, above the clamor of the city, a different sound could often be heard, the gentle plucking of a stringed instrument, the lilting melody of a medieval song. Music was everywhere in the Middle Ages. It echoed through the halls of castles, drifted out from open windows, and up and down the social rungs. Music was for the nobility and the peasants, a timeless lullaby and a battle cry, a hymn of faith and a song of love. It knew no class, no custom, no creed. It was simply there, woven into the fabric of life, making the Middle Ages, believe it or not, a thoroughly modern time. For music, like work, like prayer, like the relentless march of the clock, was a part of everything. Now, if you want to know what life was like in a medieval village, click here. Or to find out what it took to be a knight in shining armor, click here. From the muddy boots of the cabbage-scented peasant, to the polished boots of a boy crowned with false royalty, to a silent scribe who never finished his work, and finally to the feathered quills of nobles living by ritual and rule, we've walked across centuries of medieval life. What ties them all together is not just history, but humanity. In each corner of this world, dirty, rich, forgotten, or illuminated, there were people living, choosing, surviving. Their stories, written in sweat or gold leaf, remind us that the past wasn't just made of kings and wars, but of small lives lived fully in a world very different, and yet strangely familiar to our own. Now, perhaps as the candlelight fades and your eyes grow heavy, you might dream of cold fields or quiet halls, of stories half told and destinies that never quite came true. Good night.